We are continuing our study of the life of Christ, and I asked you last week to go ahead and read Matthew 5, 6, and 7, or let's let you know that's where we're going to be. We're going to look at chapter 4 just a moment, the very end of it, because it is largely the parallel, the passage we looked at in Luke 5 last week. And so, remember what we talked about in Luke 5 last week? What that account was? Am I striking a chord of memory? Bunch of old people? No, I wasn't talking about a bunch of old people. Oh, well, I won't call you that. Yes, where they were fishing, yes. In Luke 5, and they left their nets. We also, very close to the end of time of class, we talked about the calling of Matthew, as he's called Levi in Luke 5. And the idea was Jesus called these men and called them to be fishers of men. And thus they would go out into all the world. And a lot of the things that you see that are parallels between fishing for fish and fishing for men relate. It was a powerful word picture of what they were going to do. And so it was going to be something that would resonate with them. It's something that resonates now, that we should be in the business of fishing for men. And I heard some lessons many years ago. It was at a workshop. It was a 3-part series or whatever that the speaker was talking about this subject, and it really stuck with me that to kind of help us have a fine point to what we do and what we're about in the church. And that is, what did Jesus say they were going to be doing? From then on, they would be fishers of men, fishing for men. As you know, and I talked a little bit last week, that I like to fish. And when I go fishing, I take a couple different bags of stuff. I've got quite a few different things. I like to trout fish primarily, and so I carry a couple little boxes of well, I'll say a couple. Probably more correct to say 4 or 5 boxes of lures. Some I've made, some I've bought, and then I take different baits. I'll take some worms or mealworms or power bait and different things, and just. Why do you do that? Well, because sometimes one day one of those things will work and other days it won't. And so having diversification as far as your lures and your bait makes a difference. But one thing I don't carry when I go fishing? I don't carry my shotgun. I don't carry workout equipment. I don't carry the kitchen sink, so to speak. Why? Because those things are counterproductive to what I'm going to do. I have enough stuff to carry that I actually want to have with me to not want to take extra stuff. And so my point is this. Jesus said you're going to be fishers of men. So what should we be doing in addition to fishing for men? Well, it's all a lesson in keeping the main thing the main thing. We can be busy doing a lot of things, but whatever we're about in the church, it needs to be about fishing for men. It needs to be focused on what our task is. There are a lot of good organizations in our world that give out things, that provide help, that provide assistance to different people in need, that do, like I say, a lot of good works. But their organization isn't centered around fishing for men. And some of those good works are things that even the church needs to be involved in. But what we do, we should be able to say, does this help us fish for men? That's a good way of viewing how we keep the main thing the main thing. You know, if it doesn't help us with our fishing, if you will, then maybe it's not something we need to do. Because really, aren't we about, or shouldn't we be about, trying to save as many as possible? Ourselves, our kids, and as many others as possible. And all those things relate to how we fish for men. So I think it's really good. And like I said, it's really stuck with me. And so sometimes that's a way to, you know, when you're trying to figure out what you should do, oftentimes the best thing you do is know what question to ask. If you know the right questions to ask yourself, a lot of times the right answers come about. In other words, is this something we should do? And then the question is, does it help us fish for men? That's a good question. One of the other, just this is a freebie, just throwing it out there. You look at what to do in life. Here's a great question. Does my activity in this help me draw closer to God or further away? And if the answer is it takes me further away from God, well, that's a pretty good indication it's not what you need to do. Is this helping or hurting my relationship with God? And that all of a sudden, some of those hard questions in life just got a lot easier to solve because of just that simple thing. Which is it that God would want me to do? Which is it that helps me go toward Him? So, the parallel passage of what we looked at in Luke 5 is verses 18 through 22. And it tells about, gives a couple more details. One of the details it gives is about James and John, that they left their nets with their father. They left them and did that they went, left their boat, and their father had that. So, we don't know. Maybe the father went and sold all the fish and did whatever, or hired out other people to run the boats. We don't know, but their father was left with what they had.
Did they leave servants? Servants.
Yeah, it could be something along those lines. We don't know. Yeah, of course, chances are really good that they didn't have servants because only the very wealthy did. And I don't think James and John were that wealthy, but you never know.
I thought they said, I read someplace that you have people helping.
They very well, just like anybody else, they hire helpers. Yeah, help. If your thing is to build houses, chances are good that you have a handful of people. Or if you're an electrical contractor, you hire some people, don't you? Some of you know that. You hire a few people to help you, and so it's likely that there were some of those people out there that did those things. So we don't know. It's kind of a mystery, but they themselves left what they had. Now here's the text I want us to look at in Matthew 4, the last few verses. Here at the end of the text, verse 23 and following, says, "And he went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, epileptics, and paralytics, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis, and from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan." So, Jesus, he begins his ministry, he calls his first disciples, and he goes out into the countryside, he goes out, and he begins to preach and teach, and he begins to heal people. And when you look at where the people come from, he says they come from all around Syria, and they come from the area of the Decapolis, and from Jerusalem and Judea. And when you look, these are the people that come. And when you realize these people are all coming on foot, it's a pretty big area. And so, they begin. And a lot of these people are, who is it that comes? Well, it's not the religious leaders, it's not the wealthy, it's not the elite, but instead it's the poor, the sick, the needy. They're the ones that come to him. And word, his fame spreads, and they bring to him more and more that are sick, that are struggling. It says great crowds follow him, Galilee and the Decapolis. Galilee is, of course, the area around the Sea of Galilee, and the Decapolis are those 10 cities that are on the other side that are in the area that the tribes that did not cross the Jordan stayed at, Reuben and some of the others that didn't cross the Jordan with the others, that area that they ended up settling. This area of Syria and the Decapolis are a lot of what you would consider the old tribes, the northern Israel. Of course, obviously, Jerusalem and Judea is the part that was southern Israel that stayed with God. And I wouldn't say they necessarily stayed true to God, but they're the ones that did a better job of it. They're the ones that King David was the forefather of, and the one that Christ and most of the apostles are descended from. And so that area there, and so they have become the people that Jesus preaches to. Any thoughts? Is this the same Syria that is on the news today? Yes, it's very much the same Syria. Damascus was then and is the capital now of Syria. It may not be the capital now, but it was the capital back then. I'm not sure what it's the capital now. Is it what, Bo? Anyway, Syria is the same area. Yes. In the Old Testament, it was called Assyria, but shortened to be Syria now in the New Testament times and now today. And so this area is in what, if you were looking at the way that the tribes were laid out, the northernmost part of the 12 tribes, their land would have been in a portion of this. It's the more southern part of Syria would be a part of where the northern tribes were. And so their land kind of overlapped in a lot of ways. And so because of that, there are a lot of the scattered Israelites in that region at that time. And of course, when the Apostle Paul he wasn't Paul, his name was Saul at the time, when he's going to arrest Christians and take them back to Jerusalem, remember what town he goes to? It's Damascus. And Damascus is in Syria. Well, he's going to Damascus because there's a lot of Christians there, and a lot of Jews and a lot of Christians. That's how he could get away with what he was going to do. If there weren't a lot of Jews there, he couldn't get away with it because he needed the muscle of the Jews to do what he was going to do. Plus, why would he go if there weren't many Christians there? So Damascus had both at that time. And so he goes to grab them, bring them back. It's there that he sees the light, speaks to Jesus, becomes a Christian himself in that time frame. So yeah, that's the same area.
Clint, Jordan was not a country at that time.
It was not. No.
Now, was it part of Syria or was it part of?
Now Jordan today is the part that is on the east side of the Jordan River. The Decapolis and that area that you're talking about. I don't have a map, but most of us seen Bible the Bible land maps, you've got the little Sea of Galilee at the top, and then you've got the Jordan River, and then you've got the Dead Sea, the big Dead Sea at the bottom. The eastern side of the Jordan River is what is now Jordan, and the southeastern side.
Part of Syria was part of it also. I mean, it took in portions of Syria too, did it?
Well, Syria is the more northern part. What
I
up
mean, the
above.
country itself took in what was at that time Syria.
Well,
Part of it.
yeah. Well, the old Assyrian Empire took in a lot of that because of that. Yeah, Syria was something that was a broader area than what Syria is today. But yeah, Syria would have encompassed all of that northern, what we would think of as the northern Holy Land area would be Syria. So, okay. Anyway, all these people come to him. He heals their diseases. He heals their struggles. And they're drawn to him. Well, one, because he can heal, but two, because of his teaching. And you can imagine it was an inspiring and amazing time. What is he doing? He's teaching in their synagogues, and he's proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. Well, you know one thing that is provided for is that there are all these synagogues around. The synagogues were essentially the local Jewish church building. Okay, for lack of a better term. There was a synagogue in each town. In fact, big towns might have more than one synagogue because you could only travel so far on the Sabbath day. So in the big towns, they would have one, roughly a mile or so apart because they only could go a Sabbath day journey, which amounted to about a mile or so. So anyway, so the local synagogues were your, if you will, like I say, a lack of a better term, your local church building. The temple is the main place that you would go on special occasions like the Passover and other things. But the local average Jewish member would go to their local synagogue each Sabbath day. And so Jesus went to those and began teaching and preaching. You notice that local, like I said, I put quotes around it, local church building they had, that's also what the Apostle Paul does. If you'll notice when Paul begins his ministry, even when he goes to primarily Gentile cities, he still goes very often to the synagogue. It's because it's a meeting place for the Jews. And so one of the things in God's wisdom and God's understanding that helps the early church grow is all the synagogues. Because it's there that Christ goes. It's there that later on the Apostle Paul goes. Because it gives a meeting place for people that already care about, know about, and love God. And what better place to proclaim the gospel than in those settings? And so that's one way in which the Old Testament system, as it was observed in their day and time, aided the church and aided the growth of the church. So he's teaching in the synagogues and he's proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom. He's proclaiming the good news, which is what gospel means, of the kingdom.
Hey, Clint,
Yes, Mark?
I suppose the gospel would have also included his death, burial, and resurrection.
Probably not at that point, but other than just in vague terms, but certainly in the sense of where it's headed. Because even his own disciples who are present here, Matthew and then Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, they're hearing what he's saying. And they don't get the death, burial, and resurrection until after it takes place. And so, when he does make those kind of statements, aren't understood. So,
The kingdom hadn't been established at that point. It was still a future event.
true,
It was
yeah.
seen in Jesus' model prayer. We don't pray that whole thing now because the kingdom is here.
Yeah.
We don't pray for that kingdom to come.
Yeah, yeah, and interestingly enough, when you look at, it's not really what we're studying now, but if you ever do study it, the kingdom is always in the future sense in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And in Acts through Revelation, the term kingdom is not used nearly as much, but it's always used in the present tense. And what happened? Well, the thing that happened, the only logical thing that happened is church began. And the church is the primary thing that God's people are called. And so when you recognize that before Christ's death, it's in the future. After Christ's death, it's in the present. What happened? Well, it's Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. The church began. All of those things are when the kingdom became established here on earth. And so the kingdom and the church are not entirely the same thing, but they are very similarly the same thing. Well, how are they not entirely the same thing, but yet here's the quick answer. The kingdom of God is the totality of God's kingdom. Heaven would be included in God's kingdom. The church is God's kingdom on earth. So, is the church all of God's kingdom? No. But all of the church is God's kingdom. And so, that's the way to understand that. And so, when the church became established, then God's kingdom here on earth was established. And, the church here on earth is not the end. It's actually the beginning to get us to where we ultimately are, where we spend eternity. Okay, so the gospel, back to your answer, Mark, I don't think included that in the sense of he laid it straight out there and they got it. But obviously that the gospel is, in reality, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ and the good news that comes from that. And so, in a foreshadowing place, in the broad terms probably, but not, because they didn't get it, they didn't understand. But they knew, what they knew was something great's happening. He's doing things that no one else has ever done before, and not on a level that no one ever is going to do after that. The apostles are going to do great things, but not quite on the level that Christ does.
Because it's one thing to say, God has a great plan for your life. If you follow God's rules and the rules that I'm giving you from God, you'll have a better life. That's good news. And you may inherit eternal life through faith in Him. It's another thing to say, I'm that person. I am the Christ, and this is what's going to happen to me.
Yeah, and that was
Because of me, you will then inherit heaven, and that is the best news of all.
right, and that was in a sense, you might call a delicate balancing act that Christ gave. He never was untruthful, but there were times that he didn't tell everything because the time wasn't right for him to tell everything. And so those things got revealed over time such that ultimately it was necessary for him to go to the cross. Well, not everything could be revealed, or else something would have intervened otherwise. So there had to be at least a partial secrecy, a blinding, if you will, until such time that it could be revealed what God's plan ultimately was. But certainly the gospel was there, and he was that good news. But you're right, Mark. There's a difference between saying that it's coming, but that I'm it. That he would be saying, and he, like I said, there was a delicate balance. That there are times that he went over that he stated it declaratively enough that the Pharisees and scribes wanted to kill him. They wanted to stone him one time because they said he was blaspheming. Well, they eventually killed him on the cross because of that fact. And had he not been the actual Son of God, he would have been blaspheming. That's the thing to recognize. What he said was blasphemous. Unless he was really the Son of God. Okay,
But one other thing while you're there.
sure.
He was healing people to establish who he was, to prove who he was. Not once in any of this, which is his early ministry, did it say that people had to have faith or believe in order to be healed, nor does it say how much they had to pay for that healing.
Yeah, I don't think there was any money changing hands. That's a definite. But yeah, it wasn't necessarily, there's no statement made about faith or confession or anything like that. There has to be probably some faith because they're bringing these people from all around. You don't just tote somebody that's paralyzed for no good reason. So especially if you're going out of town doing it. So
But
you're,
that may have been someone else bringing him, it doesn't mean the one that healed had any faith.
true,
I
true,
think it could have been
yeah.
somebody.
true.
The woman that touched Jesus' robe, just to touch him, he stopped and said, "Who did that?"
Right.
Because of your faith.
Yeah. And faith is clearly an element in healing. But the only times that healing fails, like when in Matthew 17 and in the same parallel passage in Mark 9, when Jesus comes up to his disciples and they're trying to heal the boy that's got the demon possession. The reason why it didn't work wasn't because of the boy with the demon possession and the man. It was because of the lack of the faith on the disciples' part. It was the healer's problem. And so, if there is a paradigm in Scripture as to a failed healing, it's upon the part of the individual doing it. So, take that, if you're a faith healer. Well, if it doesn't work, it's because you're the problem. Well, because also the flip side of that is if the healer has enough faith, it didn't matter. Because, Peter and John healed a man in Acts chapter 3 that was expecting some money from them. And Peter says, silver and gold I don't have, but what I have I'll give to you. In the name of Jesus of Nazareth, rise and walk. He had no clue what Peter was going to say. Other than he expected Peter to give him some money. And so did he have faith? No indication at all of faith. Also, something I don't know if you've ever really thought about. The man that Peter and John healed at the gate had been there a long time. Wonder how many times Jesus walked past him. Is that one of the main gates of the temple? His life purpose was what took place in Acts 3 and 4. I don't think that Jesus healed everybody he encountered. I don't believe he did. Now, he healed the people that asked, but I'm not sure that everybody asked. They're new to ask. And so, this man at the gate, Beautiful, was there for many, many years. Well, if he'd been there many, many years, Jesus went in and out of that temple many times during his ministry. So, anyway, there's just something to think about. That might blow your mind, huh? But, and it probably wasn't the first time that Peter and John went by there. But that day, he was healed. Okay. The crowds follow him. They're coming to him. He's preaching and teaching. He's telling about the kingdom coming. And they're all excited about it. 5 verse 1. It says, seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain. When he sat down, his disciples came to him. Now that's the first verse of the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount, one of my, I say favorites, you know how that is. preachers have favorites, and it encompasses almost all the Bible, doesn't it, Andy? There's so many favorites you have. I say one of my favorite passages, but what's not to like about preaching and teaching from the Sermon on the Mount? I mean, after all, it begins with Beatitudes, and you've got the Golden Rule there, and just a lot of other things. But I want to look at this first verse. Let's slow down, because this first verse usually gets skipped over. You go straight to the Beatitudes, which is, one of the greatest statements ever made in all of human history. And so we usually do a flying leap past verse 1. But what's there in verse 1? First of all, he sees the crowds. There are crowds following after Jesus. He has stirred up a lot of interest. A lot of people want to know about what he has to say. A lot of people want to hear what he has to say. Why are they coming? Well, they're coming because of what we just saw in the previous few verses. They're coming because they've heard about his healing. They've heard about what he's doing. He's telling them about the gospel of the kingdom. He is building upon what John did. This same region is the region that John, the baptizer, taught and preached. And people came to him. Well, Jesus has kind of taken a couple steps further beyond where John was. And so the crowds, they're coming to him. They're following him. So, he sees the crowds. What does he do? What does he do? He goes up on a mountain. Okay. Why would he go up on a mountain?
Didn't have a pew.
Yeah. He didn't have a pulpit. We don't have a pulpit because we elevate the preacher. I think sometimes people think that. We do that because most of us are either average height or shorter. I think I'm just 1 inch below average height, so I'm not too far off of that. So I still call myself average, only being 1 inch shorter. But, if I'm not up there and we get this auditorium full, you can't see Andy or myself. And so it's a practical thing. You put them up higher. Another way you can do it is if the auditorium is the last congregation I preached for, when they went to excavate the building, there was a massive rock they found right in the middle where they were going to put the auditorium. So what do? They couldn't have a hump. So what they did was they did kind of like a theater thing. You know how most movie theaters, kind of the floor kind of slopes down like that? So it did that. So you want to be careful when you're walking down through. It's got a little bit of a slope to it. So you can do that, and then you don't have to put the pulpit up. But we do that at practicality, just simply so people can see. But because he didn't have a pulpit, remember last week we looked in Luke 5, what did he do? He hopped in a boat and got out from the shore. Because a little bit of distance got him out there so that if he you want to have a little bit of, you have to have a spray section, the preacher spits while he's talking, you sometimes do that. So, you kind of give him a circle, and you give him a little bit of room so that you're not right on top of him. And so, and you got to be able to see people and project the people. And so he went up on a hillside, a mountain. We'd call it probably a hillside, but a mountain. He goes up there, and then what does he do, Barbara? He sits down, okay? Yeah, he sits down. Well, why? Well, it's a relaxed setting. He's up on the mountainside, and he sits down. I think largely to give people a cue. Because what are they going to do? They're going to sit down too. He's sitting down. They're going to sit down. And it shows you in some ways the relaxedness of what he's going to do. It's going to show you the intimacy of what he's going to do. He's not intimidating sitting down. He's going to teach with power. But he's going to do so sitting down. Those two things, when you see communication experts and all, that if you're going to really try to express power, you stand and look big. Well, he's going to, if you will, proverbially stand and look big with his words, not with his gestures. He sits down. Undoubtedly, the people sit down. Disciples come to him, and all the people all around the hillside come to him.
How long did it take to preach this sermon?
Well, that's a good question.
3 chapters?
Yeah, well, here's what most scholars believe, and I think it makes sense, that this is not the text verbatim of what he taught. The reason being, if you were to read this out loud, and I've read it, in sermons or whatever, I'm not quite as, well, let's say not quite, I'm not as good as Andy Robinson. If you remember our gospel meeting a couple years ago, Andy taught on that, and then the last night he quoted it. I can quote good-sized sections, but I've never fully attempted to do that. If you do that, I've timed it. I've read it and timed it. And if you read it at what you would call a normal pace, not lawyer speak like you hear at the end of a commercial, but if you speak at a normal volume, about 17 minutes. A couple things you can say about that. You can say a whole lot in a short amount of time. Number one, I've never preached a sermon other than when I read this verbatim, that you say more in less time. And two, it does kind of give you an indication almost that this is more of a day thing. And so, to answer your question, most scholars believe that this is largely the high points or the meat of what he said during that sermon. It could be his statements verbatim, and if it is, it's less than 20 minutes. It seems more likely to me because of the effort to go up on the mountainside and sitting down and the things associated with it. It seems pretty plausible to me that this is just simply the shortened version of what he said on that day and time. So, and that's largely opinion based. We have what we need to know for sure. If you take in that vein, if you take Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that people have dissected, there's people that have a whole lot more time on their hands than I do, and there have been some research projects where they take individual days from the life of Christ and they figure them up, and I'll take their word for it, but I've heard it on multiple sources that in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that there are roughly only 40 days, specific days, mentioned in the life of Christ. We only have about 40 different days that we have recorded what he did on those days. And very much like the last words of the Gospel of John, which says, if all the things that could be written were written, what is it? That the earth couldn't hold the books. Yeah, the earth couldn't hold all the books. And so the point is that there's no way to have it all. But also John wrote in John 20 and 31, the last verse in the next to last chapter, that it says Jesus did many other signs and wonders in the presence of his disciples. But these are written, what? That you might believe and have life in his name. What we have is what we need. And what we have is what will help us believe and have life in his name. We will get to what we need. You look at what the text we just read at the end of chapter 4. what does he do? He goes to a lot of different synagogues. He heals every disease, every affliction, and he heals various diseases and pains, casts out demons, heals epileptics, heals paralytics. You know what? Every one of those is going to have a story with it. Every time he does something like that, there's a story attached to it. And some of those obviously would be different, more different than others. They're all going to be unique, but you look at the healings of Christ, they're unique, the ones that are recorded.
God gave us what we need. And if, can you imagine, I've heard it said that if man moved along and take a truck and bring it to church.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
we try to make things more complicated than they are.
And maybe that's part of the reason why there were fishermen and tax collectors writing it, because of, if it had been, no offense to any of these positions, but if it had been lawyers or politicians, it would have been, like you said, it'd take a truck to take it anywhere. With all the clauses, and that's one of the great proofs of the Bible is the shortness of it, the simplicity and the shortness of it. If man was behind it, we'd want to come up with all the loopholes and scenarios and contingencies and all that stuff. And Christ didn't do that, didn't speak that way. Okay, well, let's go real quickly over to chapter 7, and just give me about 1 minute, Jim, and then you can get it. Here's the last couple verses. Now, like I said, we didn't look at the text of the Sermon on the Mount, but there's a lot of awesome things in there. Some of the best stuff in all the Bible, some of the best stuff in all of human history is written in the Sermon on the Mount. I would say this: if you live out the Sermon on the Mount, you're going to be pretty close to being what God wants you to be. Now, there's nothing about how to become a Christian and other things, but how you live as a Christian, you got the Sermon on the Mount down, you're good. Anyway, but this is what it says in verse 28 and 29. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. He taught with authority because, as Mark was saying, it's one thing when he says, I'm the one. He was speaking declaratively as making law and saying, this is the way it is. And in a way that scribes didn't do. In the way that no other individual could ever do. He's speaking in a way that's very, very different. And that's what you find from the Sermon on the Mount. So, anyway, thank you. And we will look next week at some of the teachings of Christ and his miracles. If you want to look at Matthew 8 and 9, I think we'll look at some of those things, because there's quite a few miscellaneous miracles in there to kind of get a flavor of his miracles. Read Matthew 8 and 9, you'll be pretty close to where we're going to be for next week. Thank you.